We're discussing a large topic here, nation states versus EU institutions. I'm a member of the European Parliament. I've been a member since 2019. Quite a tumultuous time, I must say. A lot of personal experience in this sense, and I'll mention a few, but I thought to begin by saying a few words about a statement made by Prime Minister Viktor Orban a few years ago, which has become probably the most quoted thing, or one of the most quoted things that he has ever said. It's his comment about illiberal democracy. I think it's important to elaborate a bit on what he meant by it. He himself has gone back to this topic from time to time, and much has been written and said about it, very often, obviously, with an attempt to misinterpret it and portray it as something against liberty. It is not, and that's why I think partly why it's important to talk about this and begin by this, and this will lead us to our topic and the question of nation states and how the European Union operates these days. In our view, and this is what he explained in later interviews, democracy does not need an adjective before it. Democracy means, and it should mean and continue to mean, the power of the people, the power to the people through democratic processes, but it should not be limited to any ideology. And this is exactly what's been happening with liberal democracy. And let me tell you what I mean by it. In our conviction, different types of government can grow out of a democratic system, and especially democratic and free elections, like Christian democracy or conservatism, like social democracy and a decidedly left-wing polity, as well as liberal democracy that puts the emphasis on freedom. And we all acknowledge the importance of liberalism of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And it's true that democracies have incorporated many of the values of liberalism, but we also see a different type of liberalism today, and those ones who call themselves liberals now very often have very little to do with liberty and certainly the classic form of liberalism. I also want to mention here patriotism and or nationalism. That's a term that's often used in a negative sense. But patriotism and the virtue of nationalism, like Yoram Hazony has written about it, like Balázs Orbán yesterday talked about it in his intervention, remain important. They are not limited to one or the other of the ideologies, but we continue to believe that they are and they will continue to be the framework, the context in which decisions are best made for a community. If there is loyalty, if there's a common culture, common language, cultural identity shared, then patriotism, love of country, and love of national contexts or frameworks remain important. Now, in Mr. Orbán's analysis, after the defeat of totalitarianism in Europe at least, 1989-1990, liberalism and the liberal ideology has increasingly hijacked the notion of democracy, trying to say that the only real interpretation, the only real democracy is liberal democracy. And by that, it immediately opposes other value systems, other ideologies like Christian democracy and a more traditionalist worldview. Now, if liberals focus their efforts entirely on equality, as they often do, based on freedom, and they reject concepts like tradition. They reject concepts increasingly like traditional morality or Christian morality as it appears in political decisions and in the political arena. Then they become easy to attack, and in fact, they become unprotected against a continuous onslaught by what I would actually call neomarxism. This left-wing theory, or left-wing practice rather, that has become more and more aggressive and assertive over the few years. We see this very much here in Brussels, but we also see it in the United States and elsewhere. These groups come up with newer and newer equality agendas, and if democracy is limited to liberalism and equality, then there is no protection against these attacks, and that's what's happening. And this is what we've seen when we have witnessed the sort of LGBTIQ+++, it never ends, this kind of movement, and how it has incorporated itself into now every single decision and discourse, at least here at the European level, is like that. But we also see in America wokeism, or the cancel culture, as results of this weakness of the democratic system and this denial of traditional values, cultural heritage, and morality that is based in the Christian tradition. And again, that should not be confused with going to church or having a religious life or not. That's an individual decision in our view, a personal one. But in terms of a moral system and an overarching fundamental set of values, the Christian tradition and Christianity remain important. It is also a never-ending process, this corruption of democracy and liberty by leftist radicals. So for conservatives and Christian Democrats, who are by nature very often not activist type of people, but people who would like to conserve, values and have a nice life, etc., we must come out of our comfortable living rooms. We realized this in Hungary some time ago already, and actively defend our values and point out where this new trend makes actually democracy vulnerable and anti-democratic. Absurdly, today the situation is it's conservatives, it's Christian Democrats who have to defend liberty against liberals, against those people who like to call themselves liberals, but in reality they are against freedom, they are against the freedom of thought, they are against plurality of views in a number and an increasing number of topics. Coming to the point of EU institutions versus nation states, we see this kind of leftist agenda dominate the corridors here, especially in the European Parliament, but also in many instances at the European Commission. And parallel to their appearance comes anti-democratic and anti-freedom changes to how the system works. And this is very clearly manifested in the way how unelected bureaucrats, especially sitting in the European Commission, people with no political legitimacy, people who are not standing at elections and do not have the voters' direct support, increasingly they want to overwrite decisions made by democratic parliaments, national parliaments, decisions and topics that belong to the national level. It's one thing that we have European treaties, but these treaties are increasingly not respected by the Commission, which, after Jean-Claude Juncker, he was the first one to say this, has really operated as a political commission. Instead of being a guardian of treaty, which takes care of the management and the operation of the European Union institutions, it's increasingly become a political actor. And again, very often nation states or member states seem let alone and defenseless. And that's why I think those governments that have stood up against this pressure and this new trend, in particular the Hungarian government led by Viktor Orbán and the Polish government, they have been in the center of political attacks to the point of political blackmail and the withholding of funds, which they still continue to do and threaten with, even during these days of war. Yesterday I was here in the morning and then I had to go back to the Parliament in the afternoon. I spoke at the debate about the European Council conclusions, and that's the point that I made there too, that it was already unacceptable, this political blackmail before the war against these countries, just because of ideological differences and an open representation of traditional Christian democratic values and policies. It was already acceptable before the war. But since the war, and since the fact that it's Poland and Hungary who have now been welcoming millions of refugees, that these countries are still being blackmailed, that's outright scandalous. It's just unacceptable. And we need to get back to a democratic functioning of the European Union, which must be based on the respect of member state competencies and existing treaties. And we must also point out how this onslaught about issues such as migration, for instance, such as value-based debates like marriage, like the raising of children. Hungary is in the middle of a battle to defend children, for instance, from unwanted LGBTI propaganda at kindergartens and schools. We see that happen elsewhere, and we want to make sure it doesn't happen in Hungary. And that's just another area where we are being attacked. And of course, this also brings us to the question, but that will be, I think, for my colleagues perhaps to speak more about, of human rights. And are human rights endless? And who defines human rights? And how do these relate to political decisions, also at the European level, when we have a strategy by the European Commission in which they want to categorically announce that, for instance, marriage and the definition of marriage must now be done at European level, and the member state governments, parliaments just have to accept whatever directive comes from here. And they refer to human rights, why they are doing this, then this legitimately brings up the question of how do you define human rights and where do they really end? There will always be a real existing or an imagined super minority coming up with a new agenda. And as I said, if democracy becomes unprotected against this onslaught and it limits itself to this egalitarian liberal democracy concept, then we're just going to see that never end. So we must wake up to the realities of this. Again, democracy does not need an adjective, and we need to protect freedom. And these are classical values for conservatives and Christian Democrats. I'm happy that we're here together. There's a lot to do. And I look forward to hearing from my colleagues and later on from all of you. Thank you for your attention.